Om Amriteshwarye Namaha. Om Amriteshwarye Namaha. Om Amriteshwarye Namaha. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gratitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitamritavarshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambattvam Anusandadami Bhagavad Gita Bhavadveshinim Namostu te Vyasa Vishala Buddhe Pullaravinda Yatapatra Netra Yena Tvaya Bharata Taila Purnaha Prajvalito Jnanamaya Pradipaha Prapanna Parijataya Totra Vetraika Panaye Jnana Mudraya Krishnaya Gitamrita Duhe Namaha Sarvopanishado Gavo Dogdha Gopalanandanaha Partho Vatsya Sudhir Bhokta Dugdam Gitamritam Mahata Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanooramardhanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum. Om Amriteshwarye Namaha. Thank you for joining us all today, this evening. We're in chapter 13 right now, and towards the little bit past the middle of the 13th chapter. And last week we were unable to complete verse 23. So today's review will be rereading that verse, remembering its import and exploring the meaning of the words that Lord Krishna uses in that verse. So I will read out the translation to you. Once again, we did that last week, so we won't show the slide right now. And the way that I have rendered it, slight modification of the book, is, and the Supreme Purusha in this body is also called the witness, the permitter, or we could say consenter, the sustainer, or we could say supporter, the experiencer, the enjoyer, Maheshwara, and the Paramatma, which means the Supreme Being. On the surface, this verse looks like it's only giving a few synonyms for that word Purusha, but it has a much deeper significance, this verse. In the last week's class, we talked about how contact with all the pleasant and unpleasant experiences in life is what makes us get rooted in Maya. So there must be a way to use that phenomenon in a reverse way, because this verse helps us get out of samsara. It is contact with all the objects and all those experiences that got us into samsara, submerged in samsara, but this verse gives us a hint how to get out of samsara. And that way is by contacting that which is beyond samsara. Contacting, so to speak. There is no contacting, actually. You'll see. And it's not a gimmicky technique or anything, but because it is the essence of our own being. Coming into contact with yourself should be the easiest thing in the world. But we rarely, if ever, even remember that. The reality is that the Purusha, the pure consciousness, the Atman, Param Brahma, Paramatma, Paraprakriti, pure consciousness, all of these things mean the same thing. That Supreme Being. But how do you have contact with that? That's the question. Well, while we try to wean our mind of its addiction to Maya, or what is often referred to as prayas, if we don't simultaneously make contact with something more sublime, something that gives a higher and longer lasting feeling of happiness, or we could call it shreyas, a vacuum will be created within us. Because you suddenly retreat from Maya and you restrict your interaction, contact with these senses, the objects of the senses, then there will, and since we've been living in that way for so long, a sudden removal of those things from our life, like tasty food and all the other pleasures that we may have been enjoying, the absence of that or the reduction in that will create a feeling of lack. Oh, I need something more. I need something more. And if we don't fill up that vacuum quickly or simultaneously, then soon the mind will start fantasizing about Maya again, certainly. So to avoid such a predicament, Lord Krishna provides us with these suggestive terms that help us understand the glories of the Paramatman. And if we understand the glory of the Paramatman, then there's a chance that we might get more of a chance that we might be able to fill up that vacuum in our mind and our heart when we reduce our contact with worldly objects. It means pleasures, and also it'll reduce our reaction to unpleasant experiences. Now, the way for us to understand this verse, we are lucky because we have Amma. And all these terms that he is using, we can just apply them to Amma. That's a way that we can better understand our own Guru. We talked about her being Purna Brahma Sarupini Satchidananda Murti, but when we read these words, it may not be immediately evident that they're describing Amma. But we should consider them to be a description of Amma's existence and her constant experience. And this approach to this verse and all the verses that talk about Atman, Paramatman, Brahman, all those references will help us better understand Amma. If we remember to sort of superimpose that on Amma or superimpose Amma on that. Right now we have a personal relationship with Amma, but not with the Brahman. It's ourself, but we are just not in contact with it enough. And another way we can make use of these verses is just tips for us to remember Amma internally throughout the day. And that is also another way of coming into contact with the Supreme Being, with Amma, our true self. We need some kind of trigger that helps us remember. So these words, you can take them in that sense. We can also give ourselves reminders that this is how we should be looking at Amma and our own self. Because coming in contact with Amma means coming in contact with the Atman. So the actual words, let's go into those. He uses that wonderful word, the witness. And I want to share something with you. This is the part that we couldn't cover last week, and I was really, waiting for this week so I could share this with you. In Awakened Children, Chapter 7, Awakened Children 7, Chapter 3, Amma talks about the Sakshi Bhava, or the witness state, for a long time. And I'm going to read the major portion of that section, but you're going to want to go back to it and read it and reread it again. So I'll go fairly quickly because we have a lot to discuss today. Amma said, "The mind is the ego which makes you very self-centered. But instead of being self-centered, you should be centered in the self, the Atman, the real center of your existence. For this to happen, the mind should be extinguished. The ego should die. Only then can you become established in the state of Sakshi Bhava, of witness consciousness. And then a question came, is witnessing a function of the mind, or is it an experience beyond the mind? What do you think? Which one? Amma immediately said, no, it's not a function of the mind. Sakshi Bhava is a state in which you remain constantly detached and untouched, simply watching everything that happens, without the interference of the mind and its thoughts. That is a really big point. Without the interference of the mind and its thoughts. That would be wonderful to have that all the time. You cannot be a witness to everything if there is a constant interference from the mind. The mind consists of thoughts. It can only think and doubt. In that supreme state of witnessing, you constantly abide in your true nature. It's literally the highest state, right? You simply watch everything. There's no attachment or involvement. There's only watching. You will even witness your own thoughts. And as you consciously observe your own thought process, you are not thinking. You are not doing anything. You are still, without being moved or affected by anything. How can the mind be in a state such as this? The mind cannot witness. The thinking process belongs to the mind, whereas witnessing belongs to the higher self. The mind and its thoughts are not real. They are the fiction of our own creation. Consciousness alone is real. Thinking may seem natural to you, but it is not natural. It is not part of your real existence. Your thoughts and your ego create nothing but restlessness and agitation. She knows exactly what's going on in our mind. They don't belong to you, and you will continue to be restless until they are eliminated. In the state of Sakshi Bhava, you are absolutely conscious, simply watching with perfect awareness. On the other hand, when you are identified with your mind and your thoughts, you are not conscious. You are far away from pure consciousness. More and more accumulation and indulgence will only create more thoughts, and more thoughts will drive you away from your real center. In order to witness, one needs to be established in a supreme state of detachment. See, she said that all the attachments to things in the world is taking you away from your true center. So in order to be in touch with that, you have to have some detachment. She said supreme state of detachment. This is like 35 years ago, I think, that she said this. So it's, it was meant for really hardcore sadhaks or seekers. A clinging mind cannot witness. It can only be attached to thoughts and objects. It cares only about I and mine. In witnessing, there's no experience of I or mine. You go beyond all such limited, narrow thoughts. Witnessing happens only when you become totally detached from the mind and the thought process. You then become fully conscious of everything. For the aspirant on the spiritual path, this can also be practiced as an attitude towards everything. It was really nice that she added that final sentence, because otherwise we would think like it's just something that has no connection with me. But we can practice it as an attitude towards everything. So she's given us the goal and also taught us that we can use that as a sadhana by just practicing it. Now the next word that came up is a little confusing, the permitter. You know, we normally don't use a word like that, permitter. It's usually a verb or a noun, but not a noun like this. So think of it this way. The Purusha, remember that's the Kshatrajna. It means the one who knows the world. Kshatra means field, the entire universe. But there is a conscious principle that knows all that illumines this world. And without that consciousness principle, the whole universe would be like Mars, basically. There's no life, it's just big rocks, matter, and that's all you have. So it is the Purusha or the Kshatrajna, the knower, the experiencer, all these words that are coming up in this verse, That is what gives life to everything. And it is therefore the entity that permits everything. Remember, the rest of the whole universe, which is Prakriti, is inert. So what enlivens it? See, permitter means the enlivener, basically. It gives some life to all this matter. So in that sense, it blesses all of the activities of Prakriti. Prakriti is the other concept that we're going through in this chapter. It means the inert matter of the universe. So by itself, that inert matter of Prakriti cannot do anything. Without the blessing of the Purusha, Amma says we may raise our hands and never be able to lower them. Have you seen her talk about that in the retreat? You know, you raise your hand and then you can't bring it down because you don't have the blessing of some divine power. So it's kind of a humorous reference, but the idea is that it permits all these things to happen through the consciousness. It blesses all of our thoughts, words, and actions, but doesn't participate in them. The content of our thoughts, words, and actions depends on our qualities, gunas, we can say. You know, and that all comes, that's in the physical body and subtle body. So we are responsible for those because we created those in our past lives. So, and this life perhaps as well. That's why Amma tells that story about the drunk driver who crashes into somebody and then he gets a ticket and the police are going to arrest him and take him to jail. And he says, no, it's not my fault. And they said, whose fault is it? He says, it's the fault of the gasoline in the car. The gasoline, if it wasn't there, this never would have happened. So that's like saying that, we're not responsible because it's the consciousness that did everything. God does everything. No, the gasoline makes the car go, but how you steer the car, how you use that car is our responsibility. So we can never blame God. We cannot, just like we cannot blame the gasoline in the car. A typical analogy that is used in the Vedantic texts is that of the sun, which illumines the whole solar system. I won't say the universe. The solar system. And it blesses all the activities on Earth. Maybe there's some activities on other planets. We won't go into that. But on Earth, without the sun, we're all toast, basically. So very cold toast. And the sun provides equal light to all beings, irrespective of their nature, right? So it gives as much light to the lion, to the tiger, as it does to the deer, even though the deer gets eaten and it seems tragic. They all get equal light. So similarly, consciousness blesses all happenings, be they sattvic, pure, rajasic, selfish, or tamasic, which is harmful. So it is the impartial blesser, permitter of all. That's the concept. And sustainer, that word sustainer, it has come up already in this chapter. We won't spend much time on it. It means in the sense of giving existence, because consciousness, Brahman, Paramatma, is the only thing that actually exists ultimately. Because remember, at the end of this creation, the whole world is dissolved. So Prakriti is kaput, at least in terms of the visible form. That it remains in the unmanifest form, in the seed, so to speak, form, but not actual matter. So the only thing that actually has permanent existence is Brahman. So that Brahman, that Purusha, is what gives existence to everything around us. We are that, but everything that in this world that has a degree of existence, at least experiential, that reality comes from the Purusha, just like we are the source or the sustainer of our shadow, right? Can you imagine having your shadow without you? No. So the very existence of Prakriti is due to the Purusha. The next word was the experiencer, or we could also say the enjoyer. It's how you translate that Sanskrit word. It's a little, there's some leeway given there. But the idea is that the Purusha illuminates all experiences. So you cannot enjoy something, you cannot experience it without the light of consciousness. That's the point. And once we identify with our prakriti, our inert equipment, which is the body, and we've gone through this before, but it means even the energy, even the mind, even the intellect are all, they are inert because they come from the elements of of prakriti that create this universe, but it is enlivened by the consciousness. Except the problem is that we identify not with so much with the consciousness, but with the body, with our emotions, with our thoughts, etc. So that is what makes us a experiencer. In reality, we are supposed to just be the witness. But due to our association with Maya and our ignorance, spiritual ignorance, not knowing our true self, then we become a experiencer, so to speak. It's not the reality, but that's our experience. That's the problem. Identification with this is the deciding factor. So we all know that we have a boatload of identification with this and everything that comes with it. So in that sense, we are the experiencer, or the Purusha becomes the experiencer, so to speak, as it were. So here's an example. Let's say you're eating something, and while eating, we identify with the body, which we always do, and then we feel, and we may even say, oh, I'm eating some tasty food, this is so good. So that's proof that we're the experiencer. But if the very same that I am eating something, right? If that very same I is de-identified from the body, the mind, at least for a few seconds, then we can get a very, glimpse. We can get at least a short glimpse of the witness consciousness. We could say to ourselves, I'm not the one eating. In the presence of me, the witness consciousness, the sense organs are reveling in their respective sense objects. The tongue is relishing the qualities, the gunas of the food, and I'm watching. It's not a very, romantic way of looking at food, but it's a good way to practice that witness consciousness, Sakshi Bhava. We can say something like, Prakriti is interacting with itself, and I'm watching. Like you're watching a movie or something like that. So this shift in identification will help us gradually de-identify with this. And that is something that's going to help us in times of distress, in times of trouble, in times of hardship. So not when you're eating something tasty, it's not you don't want to de-identify, but we're going to need to at one time. So that you practice when everything's okay, not when a crisis comes, right? So we'll regret it if we don't practice now. Then another word he uses, it was translated in the original text from the ashram as overlord. Overlord is just an English translation of Maheshwara. And we know Maheshwara is the common reference to Lord Shiva. So Shankaracharya interprets Maheshwara in two different ways. It means the great God, basically. But great God can be interpreted in different ways, right? One way of interpreting is by saying that he is the Lord of all of Prakriti, means the whole universe. He's the Lord of it, which includes all our body, our minds, our intellects, and everything. But the Lord of Prakriti doesn't include consciousness, right? So if we are praying for a new house or something like that, we would look at Maheshwara as the Lord of the universe, because that's Prakriti, it's inert, a car, money, all these things. But for a real sincere seeker, we're not interested in those kind of things. We want to know the Paramatma, we want to know the pure consciousness. So from the perspective of the individual, the Jivatma, the individual soul, which is not separate, but from our experience it is, that is the Lord of the individual, right? The Lord of this body is the consciousness. When the consciousness leaves, this becomes mud. It starts to decompose. So it's obvious who the Lord is. And in Kathopanishad, there's a beautiful passage where the body is compared to a city, and the Jivatma, the individual soul, is said to be the king of the city. I'll read that verse to you. It's second section, second chapter, first verse. Although he resides in the city of 11 gates, the city of the unborn and pure-hearted Supreme, he does not lament. He is free. He is liberated. So that means there is hope that in this body itself we can experience life without any sorrow, completely free. It's Jivan Mukti. That's what it's referring to. Realization while still in the body. There's another similar verse in chapter 5 of the Gita, verse 13. Lord Krishna says, having mentally renounced all actions, the self-disciplined indweller rests happily in the city of 9 gates, neither acting nor causing to act. Did you catch something that didn't sound right? Wait a second. Is it 11 gates or 9 gates? First you said 11 gates, now you're saying 9 gates, right? Well, the 9 gates are the usual ones, the eyes, the ears, the nose, mouth, and then we have 2 below also, as you know. And those, that totals up to 9. But then there's an extra 2 mentioned in the Kathopanishad, which is an interesting twist on it. That means one is used only at the beginning of this life, and one is used only at the end of this life. So the 10th gate is the nabhi, or the belly button, the navel, because that is how the life is given to us when we're in the mother's womb. If you're in the mother's womb and the umbilical cord doesn't work, you're gone for sure. So the life comes in, so to speak, through the umbilical cord, or the navel, and then when the subtle body leaves this body, this physical body, it is said that it leaves through the Brahmarandhra. So that is that point in the top of the head. It's like the Sahasrara chakra, but not exactly the same. We don't want to go into that. But it leaves from there. And Amma has told a story about that also. Anyhow, that's a digression. We'll talk about that sometime. So if we say that the Jivatma is Maheshwara, it is correct in the sense that the Jivatma and the Paramatma are the same. So both can be called Maheshwara, the Lord of the universe. And finally, he uses this word Paramatma, which has been discussed a few times here. And when we look at the pure consciousness from our standpoint, we call it the Atman. But when we look at that same pure consciousness from the totality, the supreme perspective, we call it Paramatma. So it's just a difference in perspective. It doesn't mean anything different. They're both the same. Para means supreme. And so you're calling it supreme self, but there really is no superior or inferior in this case. There's only one Atman, there's only one Paramatman, and they're the same. So don't get confused about that. So let us proceed to verse 24. And we will see what Krishna has to say next. You can repeat after me. Ya evam vetti purusham prakritincha gunaihi saha sarvata vartamanopi nasabhuyo bhijayate. So how I have rendered it is, one who thus knows the Purusha and Prakriti together with the Gunas is not born again, whatever life he leads. It's much more straightforward, I feel, and still true to the original text. So the common example used in Vedanta for something like this is that of a burnt rope. So a regular rope, you can tie somebody up, you can tie a cow, you can tie all around somebody so that they can't even move their arms or legs. But a burnt rope may retain its form, but it is no longer useful for tying somebody, for binding somebody. So the idea is that, like that, all of our karma is burnt up in the fire of wisdom and can no longer bind us after that. So there's no momentum left to produce a new body because that bondage is gone due to the power of self-knowledge. And thus, the realized being merges in Brahman, never again to be reborn. So it could be Jivan Mukti, doesn't mean you leave the body necessarily, but when you leave the body, you don't come back. Maybe some Mahatmas actually make a sankalpa to come back. That's a different story. But it means, in principle, they don't have to come back. Whereas everybody else, all of us have to come back by the force of our own karma. With this verse, Krishna is concluding that topic we were mentioning about Purusha and Prakriti. There were 6 topics he was going to cover. So this is the end of those 6 topics. And we'll get a summary of all of this in the coming verses, so don't worry about that. So it's the last reference to that, but we need to understand what he's saying clearly, though. So what does he mean by one who thus knows? And what does together with the gunas mean? Thus, in this case, means as the witness, as the permitter, as the experiencer, and so on. Because that was in the last verse, we need to understand Amma, the Paramatman, as all of these things. And together with the gunas, the attributes, is a reference to Prakriti, not to Purusha. So how do we know that it's not a reference to the Purusha? Because the Purusha, he has said many times, doesn't have any gunas, doesn't have any attributes, it doesn't have any qualities. It is beyond all of that. Because imagine something that exists when the whole creation does not exist. How can it have attributes? It is the unmanifest Supreme, formless Supreme. So it is Prakriti, only Prakriti, that modifies to become all this matter, and even our inner organs like the mind and intellect. That means it includes all of our likes, dislikes, anger, desires, all these things. It's all part of Prakriti. It's a little hard to understand, but it's definitely not part of the consciousness. So we have to accept the fact that if there's only 2 things, Prakriti and Purusha is consciousness, everything else that we typically identify with our wants, and our dislikes, that's all part of Prakriti, which goes away and doesn't belong to us truly. So the most important thing to know is that Purusha is real, Satyam, and Prakriti is Mithya, unreal, because it constantly changes. It doesn't have any essential, independent existence of its own. That's the most important thing. Just like we said, we saw that video with the babies last week. They are getting terribly afraid of their own shadow. And the parents are laughing. It's your shadow. Why are you laughing? And why are you crying? And the parents are laughing. So then you can say, like, okay, Amma's laughing, looking at us crying about Maya. She says, Maya's your shadow. Why are you crying? You're such a silly child. So our own treatment of our children is coming back to us from the Sadguru. So, we somehow have to find a way to, we somehow manage to find a way to become afraid of it, even though there's no reason to be afraid of our shadow. But that's what it is. The Prakriti is like the shadow of Purusha. So let's say you very diligently differentiate Purusha and Prakriti. It's also very important that we understand which one I am. Prakriti is all this, and Purusha is the consciousness, Prakriti is the body, and so I'm Prakriti. We can also draw that conclusion by mistake. And some people do. They try in spirituality, and they're like, this is ridiculous. I'm not getting anywhere. The consciousness is not coming. I don't feel anything. I'm just going back to my worldly life, and which is equivalent to saying, I'm Prakriti, and that's all I want. It happens. So we have to be very clear. After thoroughly differentiating, we should be clear that we are the Purusha and not Prakriti. Thinking that we are the Prakriti is actually what Amma was talking about this morning. There was no translation. There's a Charvaka school of so-called philosophy. It's not much of a philosophy. It's basically all matter-based. Only things that are material matter. That's not a pun. It's just the meaning of it. So they will do anything to indulge in pleasure. It's like the modern day culture, really. They say even if you have to beg, borrow, or steal, you should pursue pleasure, because that's all there is in life, and there's nothing after death. So the modern culture is more of a retro culture of the Charvakas from a long time back. So instead of identifying with Prakriti, we should choose to identify with the Purusha, the consciousness. Now, that may not be our experience every second of the day, but we can practice, like Amma was saying. A wise person will always choose the infinite. And we're not doing that now. So we have to understand the benefit that comes from the knowledge that I am Purusha. So that knowledge is presented here partially, not completely. He says that you're never born again. Well, wow. For most of us, that sounds like a really great thing. And also, it doesn't matter what type of life we live now. He's going to talk about that. Doesn't mean you can do terrible things. It means you can be a householder. You don't have to go hide in a cave in the Himalayas. That's the point. So, I become the witness of Prakriti and its modifications, and I'm not affected by what happens to any of that. That is the benefit. In chapter 3, verse 28, Krishna said, "The one who knows the truth about the divisions of the gunas, the properties, and their actions, remains unattached, knowing that it is the gunas that are acting upon the gunas." So gunas just means the attributes of all these material objects. They're interacting with each other. You can just take baking soda and vinegar and you'll know what he's talking about. Am I doing that? Am I involved in that? No, I'm just watching the vinegar and the baking soda having a big party together with each other. Just like we can look at that objectively. He says that the whole world, everything, even what happens to this body, we're watching it. Just things interacting with each other, gunas, and it's not me. I'm not involved. And then he says whatever life he leads, which, it could be any stage in life. You could be any age. You could be doing any profession. You can have any social role that you play. It doesn't matter. You can still achieve that state, which is kind of comes as a revelation to many people. They think you have to leave everything and, sequester yourself in a cave somewhere. Here, Jnanadev has a nice a quote. "Just as we differentiate, this is the original form, that is its shadow. This is a mirage, and the real water spring lies far away. In that way, one who has realized in their mind the sharp difference between Prakriti and Purusha, such a one, although performing all worldly actions and being restricted to a particular body, does not get defiled by them, in the way that the sky does not get defiled by the clouds. He does not fall victim to the urges of the body so long as it exists, and after its fall, he does not assume any birth again. This sole mental act of clearly distinguishing the divergent roles played by Prakriti and Purusha confers extraordinary advantages upon its agent." So, this is the kind of, we call it palastuti. which is praise of the benefits of the teaching. It has multiple, meanings or purposes. It's encouragement to the student to apply themselves to achieve that necessary state. And also it helps us understand that, first of all, there is such a state, right? And that this is how one gets free from the suffering in life. Maybe we didn't even know that. So it's education and motivation at the same time. And here we can also remember Krishna's words from chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. The sage centered in the self should think, I do nothing at all. You might say, yeah, he doesn't, this guy is already doing nothing. It's not like that. You're not doing anything. Even if you're seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, going, sleeping, breathing, speaking, emptying means evacuating your bowels, holding, opening, and closing the eyes. The sage says, I don't do anything. Firm in the thought that the senses move among sense objects. Again, the Gunas are interacting with the Gunas. That's all this world is, to a realized being. And he or she is not born again. That means that they attain moksha. Not being born again doesn't mean you go to heaven and stay there forever. It means there's no more heaven either. It means you attain moksha. You merge in Brahman, which is way better than heaven, according to the Vedantic scriptures and Amma, which is the highest scripture for us. So in this context, moksha means that he lives in Prakriti, but is not bound by it. So it's a Jivan Mukti reference, that you are realized in the body. And Amma talks about this somewhat figuratively when she gives that example of swimming in the ocean. So she sometimes uses that in different degrees. Like if you have some spiritual knowledge, then when you enter the world, the ocean of the world, the waves will not create so much suffering for you if you know how to swim. But if you don't know how to swim, the world is full of suffering because you don't know how the world works. It's like an ocean. So, but here this example would be more of an ultimate, supreme reference. Like if you are God realized, you can move around in the world just like Amma does, and she has no suffering. In fact, she has all the time and energy in the world to help the suffering people because she doesn't have any suffering of her own. So when a knower enters into the world with their self-knowledge, they can enjoy the world. Whereas for us, there's fleeting moments of enjoyment and long periods of worry, suffering and sadness. So the jnani, or the knower of the self, it's like a cruise ride for him or her, but for us, our lives are like emotional roller coasters. Whoa, that was great. Oh no, oh, it's good, bad. It just keeps going back and forth, and we're completely worn out. So it's spiritual wisdom that makes all the difference. That's the point. And now we will go on to verse 25. Dhyanenatmani pashyanti kechid atmanamatmana anye sankhena yogena karma yogena chapare. This one I edited quite a bit. By meditation, some behold the self, parenthesis, Paramatma, in the self by the self, others by the path of knowledge, and yet others by karma yoga. I hope that's a little easier to follow. So like we said, the last verse was the completion of those last two topics, Purusha and Prakriti, which were preceded by 4 topics, Kshetra, Kshetrajna, the field and the knower of the field, Jnanam and Jneyam, the knowledge, which was not really knowledge, it was mostly virtues, and Jneyam means that which is to be known, which is the self. So now all 6 topics are over, and the remaining 10 verses of this chapter, from verse 25 to 34, constitute a conclusion of sorts, summing up what he has discussed so far. So here in verse 25, Krishna is mentioning some sadhanas that we can utilize to gain this knowledge, after praising it to some degree. So he's pointing out that the type of sadhana varies from person to person, perhaps, this is my interpretation, perhaps due to their past life samskaras, their mental makeup this time around, and previous experience in this life. But to put this verse in context, to really understand, we need to understand the context in which it's coming, because there are basically 5 stages for a seeker. This is one way of looking at it, the 5 stages, and I'm going to go through those, which many of them will be familiar to you, but just as a refresher, before we actually go into the verse. So the first step is undoubtedly inner purification. We call it the acquisition of Chitta Shuddhi, and that is only possible through what? Something yoga. Karma yoga. Exactly. Karma yoga is the one and only sadhana that truly purifies our vasanas and all our negativities. It removes our vasanas and dislikes, you could say. Because we're not really acquiring anything. That's an important point I should make clear. I'm going to talk about stages, and we're acquiring one thing, acquiring another. But basically, we are getting rid of or removing that which is not inherent to our being. That's what it is. So you can look at it either way. Right now, it's like, I'm laden with vasanas, what do I do? So we get rid of those. But all we're doing is we're relinquishing that which does not really belong to us. So you can look at it either way. And Karma Yoga, we know, is Amma's specialty. Not that she's not capable of doing other things, but because she knows that we need it really badly. So I want to share a story with you, which took place in 1986. And I think I had just started college at the time, so I was not in Amrita Puri at the time. But here's how the story goes, and I want to share with you because it talks about Karma Yoga, but also Karma Yoga as a kind of meditation. All work associated with the ashram was performed by the residents, and job assignments were frequently changed so as to expose everyone to all the tasks. As Amma often said, the brahmacharis shouldn't be lacking any skill. They should be able to do any work. On this morning, Amma began patrolling the ashram at 7 a.m. It was common, even when I was there. Picking up pieces of paper and the candy wrappers, you get prasad from Amma, and people would go, and they did, bow down to this Mahatma, and they'd have their candy and throw the wrapper like that. It actually happens. It's kind of hard to believe, but it happens. So Amma goes out and picks those up. She gives the prasad candy, and she picks up the wrapper afterwards. Can't believe it. As she reached the cowshed on the northern side of the ashram, the cows raised their heads and looked at her. She caressed their foreheads with the affection of a mother for her children. The floor in front of one of the cows was dirty, and the cow had apparently knocked over a bucket while drinking from it. Amma cleaned, then washed the floor of the cowshed. The brahmacharini who was with her wanted to help, but Amma would not allow it. Her face made it clear that she was pained to see that this cow was not given her drink with Shraddha, with attention. That bucket of the rice gruel, the rice water, is what they drink. It's really healthy, even for human beings. And she was so upset that this poor cow didn't get its food because the bucket was turned over and there was no one to put it back. So after cleaning up the mess, she went straight to the hut of who? The brahmachari in charge of the cow shed. Oh no. Just imagine you're the one who'd made the mistake. She comes in there and she says, "Aren't you the one who gives the cows their drink in the morning?" From Amma's question, the brahmachari knew that he had made some mistake, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. So he just stood there silently. Amma continued, "Son, the first quality of a sadhak, of a seeker, is Shraddha, of attentiveness. Is this how you give the cows their drink, their food? One of the cows toppled the whole thing on the floor. Isn't that because of your lack of attention? You were told that you should stay there until the cows finish drinking, and didn't the cow topple the bucket because you failed to obey your instructions? If you can't stay on the job till it's finished, Amma will do it. You should see the cow as if you were its mother. Caring for the cows is a form of worship of God. Didn't the cow have to starve because of your carelessness?" And then he said, "I left early because it was time for meditation." What do you think Amma thought about that? Using meditation as an escape route? Oh, it did not satisfy Amma at all. She said, if you were so intently devoted to meditation, you would have fed the cows a little early and come for meditation on time. Busted. It's a sin to let the poor animals starve in the name of meditation. What is meditation? Does it only mean sitting with your eyes closed? Any work you do with mantra japa and constant remembrance of God is meditation. The dedication you show to the work entrusted to you demonstrates your constant intent on the spiritual goal. Meditation as an escape from work, that is not how it should be. And then the brahmachari started to cry. Not because he was upset he was getting scolded, because he said this, "Amma, the other day, you went without even drinking water because 2 brahmacharis were late for meditation. I didn't want that to happen again because of me." So Amma wiped his tears, and in a very loving tone she said, "Amma was so serious the other day because they were deliberately late for meditation. They could have done their reading and writing later, but your case is different, son. You were doing seva that Amma had given you. That is not different from meditation. Dedication to one's work is meditation. Amma will be upset only if someone wastes time without doing his seva properly." Then, to make everything fine, Amma held his hand and walked with him to the meditation hut, and they all meditated together. So after that, I'm sure, we can be sure that he wouldn't have felt sad. So this shows Amma's version of karma yoga is not just you do something and you say, "Oh, I did it. It was for God." It's a much deeper perception that she has. So that's the first phase, karma yoga, purifying all of our vasanas, or as many as we can. The next step is acquisition of chitta nischalata. Chitta nischalata means mental stillness. And it is basically a removal of the turbulence in our mind. That's all it is. Removing the restlessness in our mind reveals a still mind, right? So this stage of our spiritual evolution is what we call upasana or bhakti yoga. It's not that it stops necessarily, but it means that it has a particular purpose that it fulfills. And it's a different facet of our spiritual evolution. So it includes all practices that involve forms, names and forms. So when we're doing the Mao meditation, when we're doing the white flower meditation, anything, mantra japa, all these things, there's a form, right? There's a name. So this all falls into that category of bhakti yoga. We might think of as like doing pujas and singing bhajans and all that, which is true. But when we broaden that conception to anything that involves a name and a form and concentration on that, then a broader term could be proposed as upasana. So it's just a broader version of the typical interpretation of Bhakti Yoga. And that facilitates steadiness of mind because it curbs the mind's tendency to wander. This second stage is extremely difficult to practice if our mind is laden with lots of likes and dislikes. You're going to sit down and try to meditate on Amma's form, and your mind is going to be going towards all the things that you are attached to. So it's not going to happen. So the more attachments we have, the more fractured the mind becomes, which is the polar opposite of a steady mind. So we have to continue karma yoga alongside bhakti yoga to prevent new likes and dislikes from sprouting, and because we will always encounter more vasanas as we go deeper and deeper. The ones we're seeing now is just the beginning, you know. And Amma says that when you wipe the floor, then you see there's even more dirt there. So then you have to keep cleaning. So it's the karma yoga, you know, doesn't end until we achieve God realization, really, because there's always some vasana there. Some people will say that you can drop karma yoga now when you start studying scriptures because it's not needed anymore. Amma never agrees with that kind of perception. And most importantly, for this phase 2 of upasana, from Amma, we learn that pure love is the most powerful factor in acquiring concentration and mental focus. Much of what Amma does is actually aimed at helping us experience and realize that love is the most powerful factor in spirituality. I remember when I was getting my mantra in Puri in 1991, you know, I was told, because I didn't know anything, still don't know anything, but I knew even less than that I have to choose a mantra. I mean, I have to choose a Ishtadevata, my beloved deity. And I was like, my beloved what? I don't have any beloved deity. And then someone said to me, well, in the darshan hut, which doesn't exist anymore, there's all these pictures of different deities and saints. So you could just go there and meditate in front of the photos one by one and see which one resonates with you. And I was like, oh, great. So I went in there and I was like, oh. And I was in front of each deity and I was like, nope, 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 nope. Because like I've never met any of them. How am I supposed to be attracted to them, right? And I mean, it's like Jesus, yeah, I used to go to church, but it didn't really resonate with me for some reason. I don't know why. And then I sat in front of Shiva's picture, and he was like buff, you know, he had big muscles. And I was like, oh, this might be the one. Because that was the soldier in me, because before I met him, I was training to go to boot camp and join the military. So that influence, like a tough guy image, wanted me to maybe choose Shiva. and then afterwards, like, I don't know. I have no clue, because I don't have any relationship with these. And then I looked at Amma's photo and I was like, it's Amma, because, you know, for me, that's the only thing I can understand. And she's so full of love, right? So if you're like me, which most people are like that, you need something that evokes love in your heart. That makes it so much easier to concentrate. So that's why Amma is so full of love for us, because she's, you know, she needs us to be very much connected to her. And the more love you get from somebody, the more you feel connected with them. So eventually she cracks the whip, but that comes later, don't worry. Once you're really connected, then she can really push you forward quickly. The third stage is called Shravanam. Shravanam means listening to the Guru's teaching or Gurupadesha, either directly or through the scriptures, Vedantic scriptures, the teachings in the scriptures rather. So you can imagine that this third stage relies heavily on the first two in order to dedicate our full attention and focus to absorbing the spiritual teachings. You know, chanting your mantra is kind of somewhat mechanical, but when you're trying to read a scripture, you know, you really have to focus. You can't think about food, you can't think about your loved ones, you can't think about your job. Otherwise, it's just not going to go in. And we cannot stop those two previous stages just because we have started learning scriptures, because we're not realized. Some people feel that they pick up a Upanishad or a Bhagavad Gita and now they're realized, or, sort of a premium, elite spiritual seeker. There's nothing like that. We still have to ward off the vasanas and preserve a steady mind. And one of those vasanas is the spiritual ego of scriptural knowledge. That's the most dangerous one when we start studying the scriptures. So definitely need to continue karma yoga and maintain our devotion. Amma said it this morning again. Advaita is okay so as long as people maintain their devotion. Not in so few words, but that was the meaning of it. The fourth stage is manana, which is mentioned in the I Am course as well. It means reflection, self-reflection. So naturally, if we haven't listened to, or come in contact with such teachings, there's nothing for us to reflect on. What are you going to reflect on? So you need the teachings first, and then you can start reflecting. And contemplation without learning is a recipe for confusion. This is what happened to me. I tried to do contemplative meditation before I met Amma, and it's just complete waste of time. I mean, it wasn't a waste because now I can look back and realize that it was a waste of time because I didn't learn anything. I hadn't studied anything. So I was just randomly doing things. So, but then the other side of the equation is that learning without reflection is like mixing all the ingredients of a tasty cake together, but you never put it in the oven. You just put it on top of the oven. You have to really bake those ideas into your mind, get everything clear. So that's what this phase is for. We have to examine our understanding of the teachings. Let's say you read a chapter of Awakened Children. Then you should take a moment, before you read the next thing, you have to repeat the key points of that chapter to yourself. Or at least the moral of some of the stories, the morals of the stories that you read. And you have to ask yourself, am I clear on what all this means? What would it look like in practical application? I'm almost talking about compassion, but what is that going to look like in actual life? Are there any contradictions between Amma's teachings, what I read in this chapter, and the last chapter? Because there's seeming contradictions. It's definitely not a real contradiction, but my mind hasn't been able to weave those together. So we have to ask ourselves. Otherwise, we're just going to go on with that partial understanding. We call it ajnana sahita jnana, or it's samshaya sahita jnana. Samshaya sahita jnana. Knowledge with doubts, with confusion. Then we should look at other teachings also, like the Bhagavad Gita, like the Puranas, like Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Itihasas like Ramayana and Mahabharata. Are there any contradictions? The seeming contradictions, what I'm seeing in the Mahabharata with Amma's teachings? Is the Gita in line with Amma's teachings and vice versa? Is there any disparity between the texts themselves? So how do all these various texts complement each other and form a whole? So based on a particular text, we can also try to draw a conclusion about what kind of student what's the intended audience of that scripture. Bhagavad Gita, he doesn't recommend renouncing the world. He says, stay where you are. So it's not for a sannyasi. And then the Upanishads sometimes say, renounce everything. But if you're a pregnant woman, or an expecting father, what does that mean to you? There's an intended audience for different scriptures, so you don't want to get confused. You can take away something from that, but not the part where it was intended for a sannyasi, for a renunciate. So this is how we educate ourselves. The scripture gives you one thing, but you are the only one who can sort it out in your own mind. Make sure you're not getting confused. So after all of this, we should ask ourselves a few more questions. Do I have any personal objection to any of these teachings? they're all saying the same thing, but somehow it doesn't resonate with me. Maybe, despite all the logic and reason behind them, maybe my mind doesn't accept it, or something inside of me is preventing me from accepting it. We have to do our own mind and intellectual investigation, investigate our own mind, see if there's something holding us up. Otherwise, we're going to develop a dual personality. Intellectually, we understand what Amma says, but when it comes to practicing it, my mind is resisting like anything, and I can't do it. So I don't have this firm conviction deep inside of me. So the self-reflection is very helpful in revealing the likes and dislikes that are the troublemakers. And we weren't aware of them before, so we didn't think of removing those, initially when we started our karma yoga. But once we realize in the reflection period, we're like, wait a second, the whole reason why I can't accept this teaching is because I've got a hang up, an attachment about ABC. Wow, all these years I've been doing selfless seva, selfless service as seva, I never thought about this angle. Now I really have to focus on that, because that's the big blockage right now. So it reveals all of these roadblocks that we ourselves were not aware of until now. So why am I not in agreement? What objection do I have? We have to clarify all such questions and to put the inner conflict to rest. Because if you don't do that before the next step is going to be assimilation of the teachings. So if you haven't clarified all your confusion, you're going to be assimilating confused information. And we don't want that. So you try to clarify it on your own as far as you can. Then if you have trusted people around you, long-time devotees or whatever, you can try to get help from them. Then you can ask Amma's disciples, and finally you go to Amma if you can't figure it out still. The fifth and final stage of sadhana, we're not talking about the fruit of sadhana, just the stage of sadhana, is nididhyasana. Definitely the most subtle part of the spirit of the sadhana. The goal here is entirely internal. Removing our habits, mental, internal habits, that are contrary to self-knowledge. So, very concrete examples are pride, anxiety. If we're God realized, we're not going to have any anxiety, we're not going to have any pride, we're not going to have any sadness, we're not going to be elated or infatuated with something, right? We'll just have the constant flow of bliss. So everything, if we have a thought that is contrary to that, that is something we have to catch. And the degree to which we succeed is the degree to which we will be able to dwell in these teachings, Amma's teachings, Vedantic teachings. And we won't be able to go beyond that until we ourselves undo those knots that have been tied over many, many births that are contrary to knowledge, self-knowledge. Each time we catch a thought like that, we can replace it with a thought, one of Amma's teachings, or a Vedantic teaching. The same thing. So it goes without saying that this fifth stage is entirely dependent on all of the previous stages. Like I said, it's assimilation of the knowledge, so it has to be correct understanding, clear and free from confusion. That previous step of manana, it has been compared to something that most of us haven't ever used, but you may have heard of it. There's something called a concrete vibrator. Concrete vibrator, I learned about it in India because we were doing concrete seva. And then there's this one guy, he's got this thing, looks like a jackhammer, but it's just vibrating like crazy. And he's making it touch every inch of that, area that you're pouring the cement into. The concrete, the wet concrete. And I found out that there are pockets of bubbles of air throughout that wet cement, and you have to get rid of all those, otherwise the structural integrity is compromised. And so you need this vibrator, it goes through and it gets all the air bubbles out. So That's what mananam is. It's like that concrete vibrator, and it's removing the air pockets of confusion in our understanding. Because if we don't do that, the structural integrity of our understanding is going to be compromised, and when we need that to save us from sorrow and suffering, it won't work because we didn't do it the right way. So let us say we feel worried about, there's some examples. Let's say we're worried about something due to my lack of confidence. We can say to the mind, oh, so you're the one doing everything? All these years, we were saying that, it's all Amma, and now you're saying that you're the one that has to do it, and therefore you don't have self-confidence, so you're worried? Why are you saying that? All these years you've been saying, oh, it's all Amma. So there's a contradiction. No, you're not the one doing it, Amma's doing it. So therefore, it's not your confidence that matters, it's not your talent that matters, it's Amma. So nothing to worry about. You do your duty, that's all that matters. Or if I sense I'm getting attached to something in my life, I can practice witnessing. You can just say like, oh, the gunas in my mind are drawn towards the gunas in it, or he, or she, or whatever it is. But I'm actually the one watching all these interactions, and they don't affect me in principle. So these are the 5 stages of sadhana, in brief. And most likely we're all doing a little bit of each one of these at present. But if you take an objective look at yourself, you'll see that most likely, right around here is where you are, somewhere. You'll realize, where you are if you look at yourself objectively. For most people, elimination of vasanas is just a lifelong theme, as is bhakti, So unless your mind is a constant stream of awareness focused on one thing already, assume that you need upasana, Bhakti Yoga, and the broadest sense of the term. And the fact that you are watching this video, or here present in the hall, means that you have at least started the 3rd stage of Shravana. You're listening to Guru Upadesha, Krishna's teachings, which is the same as Amma's teachings. So given all these self-evident points, we can draw the conclusion that we now need to focus more on learning, listening to Amma's teachings, and especially that 4th stage of self-analysis, self-contemplation. It doesn't mean the consciousness, the supreme self. It means clarifying all of our understanding of these teachings. Now we're going into the actual text of the verse after a long introduction. He says, by meditation, some behold the self, the Paramatma, in the self, by the self. So that root word self comes 3 times here, and each one has a different meaning. The first one, because we put it in parentheses so that it's Paramatma, that's clear. The second reference to self means the intellect, the purified intellect. So they're trying to see the Supreme Self in their purified intellect. That's sort of like the medium for perceiving it, because we haven't quite realized it. The third usage of Atma, or self, is it means with the help of the internal organ of the mind that has been also been purified by meditation. So 3 different meanings to that word self. You have to be careful when you read it. But then the question is, what kind of seeker is this verse referring to? This part of the verse referring to? Well, it's definitely it's not referring to a beginner. At the bare minimum, it is a reference to someone genuinely qualified to practice nididhyasana, which is a Sanskrit word for, you could say, assimilative meditation, taking Amma's teachings and making them your own, making them percolate deep into your being so they become part of you. That kind of meditation. So this reference is to someone who is actually succeeding at doing that. For us, it's a concept. We may try it, experiment with it. Maybe not happening so completely, most likely. But if it is, then I'm happy for you. But don't think it's such an easy thing. So at bare minimum, it's a reference to somebody who's really doing it successfully. Even then, we cannot interpret it to be that they're actually seeing the Paramatma. They're actually getting right realization. It's not quite, one reading of it is that they haven't reached that level. Another way to look at this verse is as a reference to this part of the verse as a very, very advanced yogi who has already fulfilled all the conditions we mentioned in the previous part of this chapter. They have all those divine virtues that were mentioned, and they have completed the bulk of the preparation in past lives. That's what it is. The typical examples that are given are Ramana Maharishi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and there's no other examples because they are exceptions to the rule. So don't compare yourself with Ramana Maharishi. There's only one Ramana Maharishi and billions of seekers since then. So it's the exception to the rule, and you don't use that as the rule. There's no spiritual cram school to attain moksha in one lifetime, so don't think that you're going to do it that way. Ramana Maharishi had done a lot of tapas in a previous life. That's what Amma says. So either way, the meaning of some is that only some people are ready to behold the self in the self by the self. It doesn't mean that we can choose whichever we want and some choose meditation. No, it means that only some people are prepared for it. And then he says, others by the path of knowledge. Most commentators interpret this as a reference to the third stage of Shravana, the listening to the Guru's teaching. They have gained the requisite inner purity and steadiness of mind that they can start learning the scriptures. And hopefully we are qualified to put our little pinky toe in this group because we've already started. I hope we qualify. And another category is others by karma yoga. So we certainly can consider ourselves to be part of this group because it is the stage that has the least preconditions. And if you literally translate the whole verse, you might wrongly interpret it to mean that just by doing karma yoga, you can behold the Paramatman. Some people misinterpret it that way. That doesn't coincide with the teachings in the other scriptures. It's not the truth, actually. So karma yoga is an essential part of that process, but you cannot get by with just karma yoga alone, so don't misinterpret it that way. We have to look at it from the big picture, like this 5 phases of our evolution, and all the variety of factors that affect how we progress, like our past life samskaras, our tendencies, our vasanas, our karma. We have to deal with that too. And above else, it's the presence of a realized master, a Sadguru in our life. That is the final determining factor. People, maybe we went for thousands of lifetimes never meeting somebody like Amma. And finally we met her in this lifetime. Then our progress is like, millions of times faster. Right? So that's another factor. We can't just say through karma yoga we're going to get it. And that's why the Kathopanishad says, of the self, many are not even able to hear. Though they hear of it, many do not comprehend. Wonderful is the expounder of the self, Amma, and the able attainer. The knower of the self taught by a Satguru is wonderful. It's just praising how, wonderful this knowledge is. Krishna didn't mention mananam in this verse, you might have noticed, even though I touched on it. But we should assume that it's included here because that's the traditional reference. And he didn't mention Bhakti Yoga either because that's coming in the next verse, which we will now read. Verse 26. Anye tvevam ajanantaha shrutvanyebhya upasate tepi chatirantyeva chatitarantyeva mrityum shruti parayanaha. This one is probably least edited of today's verses. Still others, not knowing thus, worship, or we could say pursue here, as they have heard from others. Even these go beyond death, devoted to what they have heard as the supreme refuge. Most commentaries interpret this verse to be a reference to Bhakti Yoga. So that's why that word worship is sometimes it's translated as worship. But those who lean more towards the knowledge, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, they like to translate it as pursue. Seems that the word has a double meaning. But we're going to go with mostly the Bhakti Yoga version because he didn't mention it in the past verse. And also, I think Amma would want us at this phase to focus more on Bhakti Yoga. So, one commentary says like this: Though the gopis of Vrindavan were uneducated and lacked intellectual flair, they made the Lord of the universe their own through pure devotion. And if learning and wisdom can be properly utilized side by side with pure devotion, spiritual progress becomes easier still. So this is much like what Amma was saying this morning. You know, we need wisdom, we need learning, we need to understand the subtle principles from the scriptures, but we have to preserve our pure devotion. And it's possible. Some people will say that, devotion is for weak people. And, once they get strong, they won't need it anymore. Amma definitely doesn't agree with that approach. So be very careful. If someone comes to you and tells you that, don't just jump on the bandwagon without checking with Amma. And since he interprets it as a reference to devotion, Jnanadev has something to say here, which I'd love to share with you. They place all their trust with complete faith on the advice of a single person. I'm going to say Amma. They hear with great reverence and concentrate their minds on the advice coming from the mouth of such a person. Don't we do that? When Amma talks, we're like glued to her. What is she going to say? And of such a person who can discriminate between right and wrong, and who are tender-hearted and inquire after and redress miseries and give happiness. That's like Amma's biography. So when we don't know what to do, we don't understand it from the scriptures and from our life experience, whatever it is, and we're at a loss, we're definitely in this category. We come to Amma, you just tell me what to do. I'm not able to figure it out myself. They respect the advice with faith, believing it to be their supreme good, and weave their lives around the very letters of such advice. There are thus diverse ways of realizing the Supreme Brahman. So this is another way. Krishna talks about this to say this is another scenario where a person may not have had direct access to scriptures. There's many people like that. It could be a physical obstacle, it could be a mental obstacle, it could be an intellectual obstacle. I went to the tribal areas of Kerala back in 1994, soon after I joined the ashram. And the people that, you go to some little remote village in the mountains, there's no way no one's going to teach them the Bhagavad Gita or even Amma's books. They can't even read. They're illiterate. So who's going to teach them these things? You tell them Amma's Devi, pray to her. And these are the important points, and they have to tell them verbally because they can't read. Or maybe they bring, Amma used to send buses before COVID to these remote places, and they could bring them to Amritapuri so they can have Amma's darshan out of compassion, right? So there's all different types of people who need to come in contact with this teaching. And even in America, before internet, it was not easy to get your hands on these books, the scriptures. I mean, we talk about internet as a foregone conclusion, but it wasn't there before. So most people don't know Sanskrit. They don't, the English translations are archaic sometimes and hard to understand. There's so many obstacles even for us. So it's an ocean of knowledge. And just like some people may have never actually seen the ocean or swam in it, many people are unable to come in direct contact with these teachings. So Krishna says you can also learn from other people. And not knowing thus means they don't learn it from the original source like the Upanishads or something like that. So they receive the wisdom from Amma. Amma's not going to give an Upanishad class. She may have a extemporaneous satsang, and you learn it that way. So it's not the traditional way, but it's actually more traditional than the Upanishads, because that's how the Upanishads came into existence in the first place. The Guru talking with the disciples. But, in Krishna's time, the Upanishads were already over. It was already there. So, it's an alternative way than the tradition. So Amma will say she doesn't know anything, but don't be fooled. She doesn't know anything because she knows everything. So it's not anything, it's everything. But she will just constantly say she doesn't know. Still, we just learn from her. That's one way of doing it. And he says that this word upasate could be meaning worship. It can also mean thinking and reflection, imbued with faith. So it may not be the typical meaning of upasana. But Shankaracharya himself says, they too who are devoted to hearing, to whom hearing is the supreme course, the best discipline for starting on the path to liberation. For example, those who themselves, lacking in understanding, accept others' advice as most authoritative. That's our relationship with Amma, right, for a lot of us. And he says even then, they will attain moksha, they will go beyond death. So these two verses 25 and 26, give the sadhanas, the spiritual practices for self-knowledge. And what happens when we gain this knowledge? What changes take place in us? Well, Jnanadev says, enough of all of this. I shall now give you the butter in the form of a conclusion arrived at after churning all the scriptures. And that will give you experience and enable you to secure without much effort the attainment of the Supreme Brahman. And therefore, I now treat that same subject, ripping all contrary dissensions, and present the pure truth, which we're going to hear next week. And with the remaining 2 minutes, I will try to respond to the questions. I may need a few more minutes. I'll try to be fast, though, because I have written down my answers already. I have to apologize to one of the people who politely pointed out that there was a question that was about a month and a half old that I had written an answer to it, but somehow I didn't share that on the day. So the question is about past lives. I kind of feel like I already talked about it, but maybe the person missed it. We can talk about it. I'll say it briefly. The person says, if we're here in this life to work through karma, wouldn't it be helpful for us to know the history of our actions? So why do we not remember past lives? What is the purpose of ending one life and starting another? Why not just continue in one linear path rather than dying and coming back to life again? The more I read this, the more I feel like I already answered it, but it's okay. What is the difference between the Jivatma and the soul? Is there a difference, or is it a cultural difference? And anyhow, so what I came up with as a response was this. Yes, in one sense, our forgetfulness makes it harder to evolve spiritually, but that is not due to poor memory of our past lives. Krishna explains the reasons for our forgetfulness in chapter 2, verses 62 through 63. Pondering on the objects of the senses, one develops attachment for them, From attachment springs up desire, and desire gives rise to anger. From anger arises delusion, from delusion, unsteadiness of memory, and from unsteadiness of memory comes destruction of intellect. Through the destruction of the intellect, one perishes in the spiritual sense. The fact is that we don't remember most of everything in life. We can't even remember last year, last month, last week. Maybe this morning, if someone says, "What did you have for breakfast?" you might not even remember. So the reason is delusion. It's not because we can't remember our past lives. We have so much attachment to things that it disturbs our memory ability. You know, let's say you had a piece of cake and it tasted so good, you had another one, and then you felt sick. But the next time the cake is there, you forget about the falling sick part. You just think, yum, yeah, it tasted really good. So the memory power is compromised when it's an object of strong liking or disliking. The same thing, just in reverse. So Amma says it is also a blessing that we don't remember our past lives. Otherwise, we would have unsettled emotions about everyone around us. We would also carry a tremendous burden of guilt due to our past actions. So consider it to be a blessing. That's what Amma says. And what is the purpose of ending one's life? Well, people commit suicide thinking that they are escaping suffering. But not only do they fail to escape suffering, it only leads to even more suffering and karma. This is another example of how spiritual understanding can help us in life. The challenges we face are there for a reason, for karmic reduction. Sorry, I'm just getting to the next part of it. There is another example of how spiritual. This is another. Yeah, sorry. The challenges we face are there for a reason. Karmic learning. Our karma, the circumstances life brings to us, everything teaches us something. Circumstances are our guru, according to Amma, because they teach us about ourselves. Not the true self, but the individual we are at this point in time. But if we don't have the right attitude, the same circumstances can feel like torture. Why not just continue in one linear path, then dying and coming back to live again? You are contradicting yourself, I said. Anyhow, repetition is needed to learn. The parents teach the children and vice versa. Not through one interaction, but by the constant repetition and cyclical behavior. Everything in life is a cycle. Just look at nature. The laws of conservation of mass and energy also verifies this. This tells us that cycles are the law of nature, the universe. Many ancient cultures believed in cyclic existence. It was only in more recent times that people started looking at life in a linear fashion. It is especially a product of our Judeo-Christian socialization. Asian cultures accept the cyclical nature of life more readily. You know what? I don't want to take time. I know I did say this before, so I'm going to have the link to that video shared with you, and we can move on to the new questions. Sorry, I know this is taking time, but I didn't do any questions last week, so I feel kind of bad. Okay, so there is a question about the version of the Jnaneshwari that I'm using, and I will give that to. I can't post it on the YouTube stream, but we'll have it posted the next time. I have it all set. I just didn't. I don't have a way to share the link. You go on to. It's actually from Samatha Books, Samata, Samatha Books. It's very old, maybe even 100 years old. I don't know. It's a very old version of the Jnaneshwari. If you want that, you can go on. It's not Dhyaneshwari. It's Jnaneshwari. And it's on Amazon. You can also download it as a PDF online. Someone sent me a link. We can share that next week too. And as I read Amma's books or other scriptures, I know the world is Maya. Like today I have a cola and French fries, and that is Maya too. But this Maya has a strong power. Sometimes I would be immersed in it and cannot extricate myself. My question is how to do or practice in daily life. Then we are no longer controlled by all outside. We can remember our true self, especially when we feel the lack of strength or lost in this world without awareness. I think English is not the native language, but I think we got the point. So I'm just going to read it out to save time. We all struggle in the same way, so don't feel bad or get depressed with yourself. Though the details are different from each person, everybody struggles to be the person they want to be, all of us. We know intellectually, but there is a disconnect between our intellect and our mind. And sadly, we spend most of our time in our emotional body, which is the mind. So the mind's preferences are typically what win the competition. So long as we lead a feeling-dominant life, the main challenge is to make the mind feel like doing the right thing. That's where we are. We're very much focused on feeling. So the mind has to feel like it wants to do the right thing. The mind needs to like what is good for it. Right now, that's not the case. But we can change that mind. First, it takes a lot of patience. The rule of thumb is to do the opposite of what the mind says. Whatever the mind says, you do the opposite, and then that's the rule of thumb. Not because you feel like doing it, but because you want to be free from the tyranny of the mind. And if you don't yearn to become free from the mind yet, you will later, after a lot of suffering. So you can approach it either passively or proactively. Each person can choose. The next question, I'm going over time. We may have to skip the meditation today because I didn't answer a lot of these questions. Last night's class, let's see, okay. One of the things that makes humans different from other species is that humans have the ability to reason, think critically. Other species don't have that capacity. Animals live by instinct. Where did we go? Not reason. Spiritually, humans are required to do so many things. I'm going to jump to the question. So looking at karma from this perspective, if species other than humans do not have the capacity to think critically, then how would another species be able to evolve from their level of existence to a higher level, such as an amoeba evolving into an animal and other species evolving into a human? I asked that question also a long time ago. It's actually very simple. These so-called lower life forms and that don't have any real discriminating or discernment power, we can say that maybe like a porpoise or like some of these highly evolved animals have some kind of discernment, but very, minimal. Whereas there are some animals that really are clearly just programmed, right, by instinct. So the ones, doesn't matter really which level they're on. With animals, they don't have the free will to the extreme where they do things intentionally to hurt other people. They don't incur additional karma. That's the point. So just imagine if we were not creating new karma for ourselves, what's left? Hardship in life, which just reduces all of our bad karma. So the animals and all these other life forms, are burning karma only because they, did you see the Emperor Penguin or March of the Penguins? Minus 80 degrees in the Antarctica. And these guys are doing it instinctively. They're going to there and back and they're starving for months. You don't think they're burning off karma? I mean, they're burning off a lot more karma than we are, right? And so it's programmed so that all they do is burn karma. And they're slowly evolving. But it's when you have free will that you can create bad karma. So that's what earth is for. In human body, it's the crucible basically. You either go up or down. And it's up to us. It's how we use our free will. Then there's a last question for today, is that tonight in class you touched on the body, the mind, and the subtle body. I was thinking of Fred versus when we see Fred after he left the body and how we say, there's Fred's body instead of there's Fred. When we are born in a new body, a new hotel, a new picnic, she's using the words that I used that last week, is the we that is reborn just the subtle body? And is the subtle body the same thing with the self? Or is what is born both our subtle body and also our same exact awful mind? In other words, you spoke of how we are married to our minds for now. But by this mitigating for now, did you mean to imply that if we are reborn, at the very least we'll get a different mind? Okay. There's good news and bad news. Yes, it is the same subtle body we have now that we will have to work with in the next birth. I guess that's the bad news. And another bit of bad news is that the subtle body is not synonymous with the self, the higher self, the Atman. It is the combination of the energy sheath, the mind sheath, and the intellect sheath. We don't have time to go into that, but the subtle body is comprised of three factors, which are three facets of our individuality, the way we see it. The self, the supreme self, is present in that subtle body because the subtle body is the reflective medium of that. We talked about it. I'm not going to repeat all that. You have to watch the classes before, then you can catch up with us. So you're going to have to watch those videos to understand what we're talking about. And yes, it will be the exact same mind. If not, which mind would it be, and how to determine what kind of mind we should get? There's no logic to that. In chapter 6, Krishna says that when we are reborn, we pick up from where we left off. That was Arjuna's concern. After doing all this sadhana and everything, learning the scriptures, am I going to have to start all over from scratch when I'm in the next birth? Krishna said, no, don't worry. So for somebody who has worked hard in this life, it's good news. For somebody who maybe feels like they didn't work very hard, then it may come as not so good news. But we shouldn't be depressed because we can always mold this mind. If you want your mind to be a certain way next time around, because it's a good chance that there's going to be a second time around, or an additional time around, then we can start molding that now. It's the inheritance that you give to yourself in the next life. Think of it that way. So if we consider that we're married to the mind for now, we should clarify that it is a marriage that cannot be annulled by divorce or separation. It's not that easy. On the bright side, however, you can change this spouse, unlike the usual spouse. If you were married, you were maybe tried to change your spouse and that didn't go well. Well, the mind, yes, it can go well. You can change the spouse of your mind. The only option is to remodel the present one. And the reference to for now meant until moksha. So that's a very long now, maybe not what you were hoping to hear. But the good news is that yes, you can mold your mind. Who else is going to mold it for you? We have to do it ourselves. But we have the master potter who can mold it, help us mold that. She's doing it, but we have to be very flexible. We shouldn't be baked clay. We should be very wet, moist, malleable clay. So she can make us into a beautiful image in her. We all want to grow in her image. Om Amriteshwariye Namaha. So sorry for going over the time. I hope people who didn't expect this signed off when they needed to and attended to their own duties. but this is now the official conclusion with the questions. And we will see you next week. We will close with Asatoma and Loka Samasta only. Take a deep breath. Om Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Lokaha Samastaha Sukhino Bhavantu. Lokaha Samastaha Sukhino Bhavantu. Lokaha Samastaha Sukhino Bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. One more long deep breath. And as you exhale, you can slowly open your eyes. Om Namah Shivaya. Thank you for joining us. We will have bhajans from Chicago ashram on Saturday. And going forward, we have decided to rotate so that we've had some requests that we don't force people to choose which bhajan session to listen to. So we're going to rotate. We will have Chicago this weekend, DC next weekend, and we will alternate. And the last weekend, we have 5 weekends this month, and the last weekend is Williya Swamiji or Swami Amrit Swarupananda Ji. His retreat will be there for Memorial Day that weekend. So mark the date. Keep your weekend free for that last weekend of this month. Namah Shivaya.